Kalorama, a recorded book's high-bridge imprint, presents How to Make Love to a Despot, an Alternative Foreign Policy for the 21st Century, by Stephen D. Krasner. Read by David Vries. Preface. Throughout its history, the United States has vacillated between two foreign policy models. One is an activist foreign policy designed to remake other countries in the United States' own image. The other foreign policy regards the rest of the world as essentially beyond repair, with the appropriate role for the United States being to demonstrate to other countries the benefits of consolidated democracy, including not only free and fair elections, but also a free press, the rule of law, separation of powers, and an active civil society, but not to actively try to create these results. Because groups or individuals with few resources can now kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, the United States no longer has the luxury of ignoring the rest of the world. But it cannot create consolidated democracies either. The United States must learn how to make love to despots. It should aim for good enough governance, not good government. Greater security, some economic growth, and the better provision of some services is the best the United States can hope for. During the 19th century, the United States was too weak to act far beyond its own borders. In the 20th century, the United States intervened in the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, in the words of President Wilson, but because of domestic opposition, refused to join the League of Nations or to sign the Versailles Treaty after the war. The United States then settled into splendid isolation, while Germany and Japan rampaged across Europe and Asia. The United States entered the Second World War only after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Before this attack, the America First movement, led by Charles Lindbergh and others, was politically stronger than those individuals, including the President, who wanted to join the nations fighting against the Axis powers. President Roosevelt seized on the Pearl Harbor attack to send American troops to North Africa, where they would engage German, not Japanese forces. American leaders ended the Second World War convinced that hypernationalism and competitive economic closures were a threat to the security of the United States. They constructed an international order that was designed to prevent such threats in the future, an order that included multinational organizations like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank. American leaders were very successful in state-building in Germany and Japan. Both countries eventually became democratic and market-oriented. An activist foreign policy could create consolidated democracy. When it became clear in 1947 that the Soviet Union would oppose the United States, materially and ideologically, American leaders supported elites in the Third World that would at least not take their countries down a communist path. Democracy was not a high priority. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and along with it the appeal of communism, American elites returned to what was a more natural instinct, remaking the world in the image of the United States. This was especially true after 9/11, when it became clear that weak, malign, and often badly governed states could threaten the security of the United States itself. The interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq have proved to be long and costly, and the administrations that followed that of George W. Bush have looked for ways to retreat from the broader Middle East. Officials as well as public opinion in general have become convinced that nothing can be done. A dystopian vision, in which the United States can do nothing, has been embraced by those on the left and the right. The greatest challenge for the United States now is to identify a set of policies that lie between the utopian vision that all countries can be like the United States, or at least some idealized version of America, and the dystopian view that nothing can be done. Americans would do well to begin with their own fraught history. The United States was the first major state to become a democracy. The Declaration of Independence was written at a time when all other major countries were monarchies. There was no guarantee that the United States would survive. It almost did not. The Civil War is still the costliest war in American history. The language of the Declaration of Independence soars. At the time of its writing, however, the United States was a slave-holding country. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person in the Constitution of the United States, which was written in 1787 to increase the population of slave-holding states. Slaves were about 20% of the population of the 13 states in 1776, even though slaves and slavery are not mentioned once in the Declaration of Independence. Racism still plagues the United States more than 240 years after independence was declared. The household income of African Americans is only about 50% of that of non-Hispanic whites. Rather than trying to make other countries consolidated democracies, or doing nothing, this book argues the United States should aim for good enough governance. The best is often the enemy of the good. Pushing for free and fair elections may only get people killed. Trying to eliminate corruption entirely may preclude eliminating the worst form of corruption. The United States must learn how to deal with despots because despotism is much more likely than consolidated democracy. Consolidated democracy is not the normal order of things. In most places in almost all of human history, elites in power have done everything that they could to stay in power. Power has meant material wealth and status, and power has usually come from the barrel of a gun or the point of an arrow, not from the voting box. Those who lose elections but have most of the guns will not go quietly into the night. Good enough governance would aim for security, better health, some limited economic growth, and perhaps some limited protection of human rights. It would complement rather than undermine the interests of elites in despotic polities. Good enough governance will be anathema to many groups in the United States, but it is feasible, and it would contribute to a world that is more secure and prosperous. I have come to understand that the problem of weak, fragile, and badly governed states has dominated most of my career, both within and outside of academia. In my early 20s, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in northern Nigeria. Many decades later, I worked at the State Department and National Security Council, thanks to the generosity and confidence of my friend and colleague, Condoleezza Rice. My time in government helped me to realize how many wise and competent people work for the federal government. Most governments are run entirely by professional civil servants. The American system allows for the presence of outsiders like myself. The many political appointments in the United States government do undoubtedly make for some degree of amateurism, but these appointments are also a conduit for new ideas. The United States has many failings, but no country has wielded such great power with so much wisdom. How to Make Love to a Despot. Chapter 1. So you want to make the world a better place. Police are everywhere, therefore be careful. They are out to fleece us and rob us of our last kopeck. Innkeeper in Boris Godunov, Act 1, Scene 4, by Modest Petrovich Mussorgsky. The United States has labored under a delusion. It has been a costly delusion, and it has hurt American national interests for 100 years. That delusion is that the world can be like us. We Americans have come to assume that democracy and material wealth are the natural order of things. We have assumed that the world, as President Wilson said in asking Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917, could be made safe for democracy. These words were echoed by President Bush nearly a century later in his transmittal letter for the 2002 National Security Strategy, which opened with the following sentence: "The great struggles of the 20th century between liberty and totalitarianism ended with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom, and a single sustainable model for national success: freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. When the rest of the world has failed to conform to American expectations, when America's utopian vision has not been realized, Americans have looked away, not comprehending why other countries have not adopted a model that seems to coincide so perfectly with human needs and desires. The concluding sentence of Donald Trump's transmittal letter of his first national security strategy, published in 2017, reads as follows: "We will remain a beacon of liberty and opportunity around the world." But at the same time, the Trump administration has embraced a dystopian view in which the United States can do nothing to improve conditions in other countries, even when American security is at risk. The United States has vacillated between active intervention to promote consolidated democracy and passive beckoning, the beacon on a hill, and it has been consistently disappointed. Weak and poorly governed states pose a threat to the United States. Modern technology has severed the relationship between underlying material resources and the ability to do harm. Millions of Americans could die as a result of actions taken by individuals in poorly governed and impoverished states because these individuals control nuclear or biological weapons. Pandemic diseases arising naturally in badly governed states could also kill millions of people in wealthier and more developed countries. The problem of governance cannot be solved through the creation of wealthy and democratic states, but it cannot be ignored either without threatening the material security of the more powerful. The United States could make itself and the world safer if it learned how to support policies that would be acceptable to despotic rulers, if it learned how to make love to despots. The best that can be hoped for is good enough governance, something that lies between the utopian vision of creating consolidated democracy and the dystopian view that nothing can be done about governance in other states. Governments capable of policing their own territory, generating some economic growth, and providing some basic services, especially those related to health. Good enough governance can be supported by external actors. Corruption cannot be eliminated. Elections cannot be free and fair unless the distribution of votes matches the distribution of guns. In despotic states, there may be rule by law, but there will not be rule of law. The law will be used arbitrarily to punish those who threaten extant elites. American naivete about the possibilities for creating wealthy and democratic states has not been based on some simple-minded, atheoretical view of history. Rather, American policymakers have always been influenced by a widely held view of how development and democracy take place, namely, modernization theory. In this approach, wealth and democracy can be attained relatively easily. All that is necessary are population growth and technological change. If countries can find the first step of the up escalator, they can ride all the way to the top. American leaders have also been influenced, usually tacitly, by a second perspective on development, one that emphasizes institutional capacity. American leaders and those in other countries of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have assumed that rulers in poorly governed states want to do the right thing. Their failures are the result of a lack of capacity rather than their desire to stay in power. This is a naive view of history and human nature. Wealth and democracy are not the natural order of things. They are, in fact, deeply unnatural. Despotic leaders do not want to provide benefits for those whom they govern. They want to support with arms or money those that can keep them in office. Wealthy democratic states have existed for only a short period of history, perhaps 150 years, in a few places in the world: North America, Western Europe, and parts of Asia. Despotism is not an aberration. The small number of states that have actually become wealthy democracies, states where political leaders can stay in power only by winning free and fair elections, have succeeded not because of structural conditions alone, but also because of luck. If the wind had blown in a different direction in June of 1588, the Spanish Armada might have been able to support the Duke of Parma's invasion force, which had been assembled in the Low Countries, then under Spanish rule. Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant, would probably have been deposed. England would never have become the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution or the cradle of liberty. Catholicism would have become the official religion. If England had been invaded in 1588 rather than having the wealthy and democratic United Kingdom, we would all be speaking Spanish. If in 1940 the waters of the English Channel had prevented the small boats from rescuing the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, the British government might have sought peace, and Nazi Germany would have been able to devote all of its resources to the defeat of the Soviet Union. The outcome of the Second World War might have been very different, as would the world in which most humans now live. The Madisonian sweet spot, first described by Madison in Federalist 51, in which the government is strong enough to provide key services but does not repress its own population, has been achieved by a very few polities for a limited period of history. Since the Second World War, only one country has gone from being poor and autocratic to rich and democratic: South Korea. Most of the United States' interventions to create modern, wealthy democracies have been failures, Afghanistan and Iraq being only the most recent examples. Because we Americans have assumed that everyone could be just like us, we have failed to identify any salient markers between Somalia and Denmark, between poverty, violence, and chaos, and wealth, peace, and order. We do not know how to make love to despots even though most of the world is ruled by despotic regimes. Political leaders in non-democratic states will not accept changes that would threaten their ability to maintain power. Good enough governance is feasible, would protect American interests, and would not preclude changes that might ultimately lead to a more democratic system. It is hardly a revelation to point out that democracy, effective government, and a free market economy cannot usually be achieved by outside actors. Japan and Germany after the Second World War were aberrations made possible by the power of the United States, the delegitimization of fascist governments, and the existence of local members of the elite who saw being allied with the United States as the best alternative among difficult choices. The Marshall Plan worked in Western Europe, but the beneficiaries of the plan were already relatively wealthy and had some experience with democracy before the Second World War. Democracy was adopted by many of the former satellite states of Eastern and Central Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, not only because of the financial and ideological incentives that could be offered by the European Union, but also because extant regimes had been delegitimized. Communism had failed. Some of these countries, notably Hungary, are already backsliding. External actors can only see through the glass darkly. They are often oblivious to local power dynamics. Saddam Hussein was able to maintain power in Iraq for more than 20 years despite having completely miscalculated how long the 1980s war against Iran would last. He thought a few months at most, not years, and how the United States would react to his invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Only invasion by the United States in 2003 led to his ouster and execution. Stalin killed or imprisoned the wives and husbands of those close to him, but died a natural death. Even though Muammar Gaddafi died in a ditch, he stayed in power for more than 40 years. Good things do not always go together. Greater security may mean more violation of individual rights, including women's rights, and a limitation on the kinds of economic activities that would maximize individual well-being. No matter how much commitment the United States makes or how well coordinated its efforts are across the whole of government, the United States will fail if its goal is consolidated democracy, at least fail most of the time. Even if the best-intentioned international actors did not live in what Séverine Autesserre has called peaceland, they would still not be successful because their objectives would be inconsistent with the interests of local elites. Despotic rulers will undermine or reject reforms that would weaken their hold on power. Humility. Homo sapiens have been on Earth for more than 150,000 years. For much of this period, they lived only in Africa. As they spread across the land masses of Earth, they initially formed small hunter-gatherer societies based on kinship groups. Only about 10,000 years ago did human beings begin to inhabit larger communities made possible by settled agriculture, which generated a surplus of food that could sustain groups of individuals, such as priests and rulers. The communities were governed by despotisms, usually hereditary, that maintained order through the arbitrary use of violence. Legitimacy was provided by tradition. These elites did not govern in the interests of the population as a whole. Their behavior and that of their minions was arbitrary and exploitative, as Mussorgsky so well captured in The Innkeeper's Lament from his opera Boris Godunov. Despots attended to the care and feeding of their own families, and sometimes not even that, and of those individuals or groups that controlled the instruments of violence. Throughout time, if individuals had the opportunity to run away from state control, because, for instance, there was inaccessible mountainous terrain nearby in which to hide, they did so. Running away from the state meant less exploitation, more calories, and better health. Hobbes successfully captured our imagination. We fear the lack of effective government, but for most of human history, in almost all places, in almost all times, life has been nasty, brutish, and short, with or without effective governance. Madison wrote in Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." Only in the last century or two, in a small number of countries, have polities been created and sustained that solved the problem posed by James Madison. How is it possible to create institutions that are strong enough to govern and provide services, and yet do not abuse individuals? Most people cannot access the legal system, even if on paper a modern legal system exists. Despots need corruption to get the resources that they need to stay in power. They engage in rent-seeking. That is, they create economic rules that allow them to steal more easily. More individuals cannot join together. They cannot form organizations because such organizations might threaten their despotic rulers economically or politically. Reaching the OECD world of rich and democratic states is extremely difficult and unusual. The most important virtue that external actors seeking to promote better governance can possess is humility. External actors should seek to promote good enough governance, not good governance. Good governance is based on a Western ideal in which the government delivers a wide variety of services to the population based on the rule of law, and the laws are determined by representatives selected through free and fair elections. Good governance will not be in the interests of national elites in most target states, which are closed access orders. Despots want to do what is good for them. Only in special circumstances will what is good for them be good for the society as a whole. External actors cannot be successful without the support of national elites, and national elites are usually despotic. They will at best support good enough governance, security, some service provision, some economic growth, because such policies will help them to stay in power. Most of the world's polities, perhaps 130 or so, are most easily understood as despotic. National elites and despotic polities will undermine efforts to create consolidated democracy or rule of law bureaucracies, because the existence of such structures would mean their own political death. There are a small number of countries, perhaps 30 or so, that can be classified as intermediate polities, in which the interests of national political elites will be mixed. In intermediate political orders, those between open and closed access, different members of the national elite, or even the same individual, might be torn between initiatives that protect their own position and initiatives that are beneficial to the society as a whole. But even in intermediate polities, there is no guarantee that external actors trying to promote democracy, rule of law, and higher incomes will be successful. Not only will external actors have to support the right individuals in target states, those whose interests would best be served by an open-access order in which rent-seeking is limited or eliminated, but there is also an inescapable element of luck or unpredictability. Structural factors do not determine outcomes. Achieving the utopian vision is possible only in a small number of polities, and even in intermediate polities, there is no guarantee of success. False expectations. In the late summer of 1963, I boarded a chartered plane that was carrying more than 100 Peace Corps volunteers from New York City to Lagos, Nigeria. I was uncertain about going to graduate school, afraid to join the civil rights movement and face the racism and violence of the American South, happy to avoid the prospect of being drafted and sent off to Vietnam, but confident that my colleagues and I, mostly new college graduates, would make a positive contribution to Nigeria's future. John F. Kennedy's words in his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," rang true for me and for the other young Americans on that flight to Africa. We were American utopians. Nigeria had become independent from Britain in 1960. It had held democratic elections. The military was playing no obvious part in politics when I arrived. Even though regional, ethnic, and religious divisions were evident, there was no organized violence among groups or tribes. I was, however, assigned to teach history and English at a secondary school in the north, Adamawa Provincial Secondary School, because the regional government of northern Nigeria did not want to hire southern Nigerians, who were often Christian and definitely from a different tribe than the Fulanis and Hausas, almost all Muslim, who dominated the north. At one point, the several Peace Corps volunteers at the school were accused of proselytizing for Christianity. As a Jew, I felt more than comfortable rejecting the accusations being made against my colleagues and me, but I should have realized that something was amiss. I was, however, young and naive, an American utopian. With the end of British colonialism, my American colleagues and I imagined that Nigeria would do well, would become a prosperous, peaceful, democratic state. The Nigerians that I met after I arrived expected the same. With the yoke of colonialism lifted, everyone saw a bright future for Africa in general and in particular for Nigeria, sub-Saharan Africa's most populous state. Ethnic, religious, and tribal divisions were obviously salient. People looked and dressed differently and voted largely along regional and ethnic lines, but none of us Americans thought that these divisions would be a driver, perhaps the major driver, of Nigerian politics. I taught at Adamawa Provincial Secondary School for 2 years. The school itself, established by the British, was located halfway between the provincial capital of Yola, a traditional walled city where the Fulani emir lived, and the commercial center, Jimeta, which was located on the Benue River near the Cameroon border. The teaching staff consisted of Brits, Nigerians, American Peace Corps volunteers, and Pakistanis, the latter because the government of northern Nigeria preferred Muslims from South Asia rather than Christians from southern Nigeria, and there were many educated people in Pakistan. In the smallest of the small world moments that I have had, the son of one of the Pakistanis that I was teaching with, now a distinguished journalist in Karachi, participated in a summer program at Stanford in 2012. The principal of the school was a Brit, as were the provincial commissioner, a simulacrum of Colonel Blimp, and several other provincial department heads when I first arrived. Over the course of my 2 years, most were replaced by Nigerians. The school functioned well. Teachers always showed up for their classes. Classes were well taught as far as I could see. Adamawa Provincial Secondary School was the only public high school in the whole province, and the selection of students, with a few exceptions, like the emir's son, appeared to me to be based on examination results. Some of our students went on to universities, at least one to graduate studies in the United States. One of our students, Atiku Abubakar, made a lot of money in the oil industry, was vice president of Nigeria from 1999 to 2007, and founded the American University of Nigeria in Yola in 2003. On the whole, things appear to be working pretty well. Within months after I left the country in the summer of 1965, Military officers staged a coup. Within a year after I left, most of the people from the South that were living in Djameta and its environs, primarily shopkeepers or federal civil servants, had been killed. In
Sample complete. Ready to continue?